The Ghost Pirates by William Hope Hodgson. Chapter 1. The Figure Out of the Sea. I joined the Morzestas in San Francisco. I heard before I signed on that there were some funny yarns floating round about her. But I was pretty nearly on the beach and too jolly anxious to get away to worry about trifles. Besides, by all accounts, she was right enough so far as food and treatment went. When I asked fellows to give it a name, they generally could not. All they could tell me was that she was unlucky, and made thundering long passages, and had no more than a fair share of dirty weather. Also that she had twice had the sticks blown out of her, and a cargo shifted. Besides all these, a heap of other things that might happen to any packet or small ship, and would not be comfortable to run into. Still, they were the ordinary things, and I was willing enough to risk them to get home. All the same, if I'd been given the chance, I should have shipped in some other vessel as a matter of preference. When I took my bag down, I found that they'd signed on the rest of the crowd. You see, the home lot cleared out when they got into Frisco. That is, all except one young fellow, a Cockney, who had stuck by the ship in port. He told me afterwards, when I got to know him, that he intended to draw a payday out of her, whether anyone else did or not. The first night I was with her, I found that it was common talk among other fellows that there was something queer about the ship. They spoke of her as if it were an accepted fact that she was haunted. Yet they all treated the matter as a joke, all that is except the young Cockney, Williams, who, instead of laughing at their jests on the subject, seemed to take the whole matter seriously. This made me rather curious. I began to wonder whether there was, after all, some truth underlying the vague stories I'd heard, and I took the first opportunity to ask him whether he'd had any reasons for believing that there was anything in the yarns about the ship. At first he was inclined to be a bit offish, but presently he came round and told me that he did not know any particular incident, which could be called unusual in the sense of which I meant, yet that at the same time there were lots of little things, which if you put them together made you think a bit. For instance, she always made such long passages, and had so much dirty weather. Nothing but that, and calms and headwinds. Then other things happened. Sails that he knew himself had been properly stowed were always blowing adrift at night. And then he said a thing that surprised me. "There are too many blooming shadows in this here packet. It gets on your nerves like nothing else I've ever seen before in my life." He blurted it out in a heap, and I turned round and looked at him. "Too many shadows," I said. "What on earth do you mean?" But he refused to explain himself or tell me anything further, just shook his head stupidly when I questioned him. He seemed to have taken a sudden sulky fit. I felt certain he was acting dense purposely. I believe the truth of the matter is that he was in a way ashamed of having let himself go like he did, in speaking out his thoughts about shadows. That type of man may think things at times, but he doesn't often put them into words. Anyhow, I saw it was no use asking any further questions, so I let the matter drop there. Yet for several days afterwards I caught myself wondering at times what the fellow had meant by shadows. We left Frisco next day with a fine fair wind that seemed a bit like putting the stopper on the yarns I'd heard about the ship's ill luck. For the first couple of weeks out, nothing unusual happened, and the wind still held fair. I began to feel that I'd been rather lucky after all in the packet, into which I had been shunted. Most of the other fellows gave her a good name, and there was a pretty general opinion growing among the crowd that it was all a silly yarn about her being haunted. And then, just when I was settling down to things, something happened that opened my eyes no end. It was in the 8 to 12 watch, and I was sitting on the steps on the starboard side, leading up to the forecastle head. The night was fine, and there was a splendid moon, away aft. I heard the timekeeper strike 4 bells, and the lookout, an old fellow named Jaskett, answered him. As he let go the bell lanyard, he caught sight of me where I sat quietly smoking. He leant over the rail and looked down at me. "Is that you, Jessup?" he asked. "I believe it is," I replied. "We'd have our grandmothers and all the rest of our petticoat relations coming to see, if it were always like this," he remarked, reflectively, indicating, with a sweep of his pipe and hand, the calmness of the sea and sky. I saw no reason for denying that, and he continued, "If this old packet is haunted, as some of them seem to think, well, all I can say is, let me have the luck to tumble across another of the same sort. Good grub, decent crowd of 'em aft, and everything comfortable, so as you can feel your nose where you are. As for her being haunted, that's all hellish nonsense. I've come across lots of 'em before it was said to be haunted, and so some of 'em was, but 'twasn't with ghosts. One packet I was in, they were so bad that you couldn't sleep a wink in your watch below until you'd have every stitch out of your bunk and had a regular hunt. Sometimes, at that moment, the relief, one of the ordinary seamen, went up the other ladder onto the forecastle head, and the old chap turned to him and asked why the hell he'd not relieved him a bit smarter. The ordinary made some reply, but what it was I did not catch, for abruptly away aft, my rather sleepy gaze had lighted on something altogether extraordinary and outrageous. It was nothing less than the form of a man stepping inboard over the starboard rail, a little abaft the main rigging. I stood up and caught at the handrail and stared. Behind me someone spoke. It was the lookout, who'd come down off the forecastle head, on his way aft to report the name of his relief to the second mate. "What is it, mate?" he asked, curiously, seeing my intent attitude. The thing, whatever it was, had disappeared into the shadows on the lee side of the deck. "Nothing," I replied shortly, for I was too bewildered then at what my eyes had just shown me to say any more. I wanted to think. The old shellback glanced at me, but only muttered something and went on his way aft. For a minute, perhaps, I stood there, watching, but could see nothing. Then I walked slowly aft, as far as the after end of the deck-house. From there I could see most of the main deck, but nothing showed, except, of course, the moving shadows of the ropes and spars and sails as they swung to and fro in the moonlight. The old chap who had just come off the lookout had returned for it again, and I was alone on that part of the deck. And then, all at once, as I stood peering into the shadows to leeward, I remembered what Williams had said about there being too many shadows. I had been puzzled to understand his real meaning then. I had no difficulty now. There were too many shadows. Yet shadows or no shadows, I realized that for my own peace of mind I must settle once and for all whether the thing I had seemed to see stepping aboard out of the ocean had been a reality, or simply a phantom, as you might say, of my imagination. My reason said it was nothing more than imagination, a rapid dream. I must have dozed, but something deeper than reason told me that this was not so. I put it to the test and went straight in amongst the shadows. There was nothing. I grew bolder. My common sense told me I must have fancied it all. I walked over to the main mast and looked behind the pinrail that partly surrounded it, and down into the shadow of the pumps, but here again was nothing. Then I went in under the break of the poop. It was darker under there than out on deck. I looked up both sides of the deck, and saw that they were bare of anything such as I looked for. The assurance was comforting. I glanced at the poop ladders, and remembered that nothing could have gone up there without the second mate or the timekeeper seeing it. Then I leant my back against the bulkhead and thought the whole matter over, rapidly sucking at my pipe. And keeping my glance about the deck, I concluded my think and said "no" out loud. Then something occurred to me, and I said "unless," and went over to the starboard bulwarks and looked over and down into the sea. But there was nothing but sea, and so I turned and made my way forward. My common sense had triumphed, and I was convinced that my imagination had been playing tricks with me. I reached the door on the port side leading into the forecastle, and was about to enter when something made me look behind. Away aft, a dim, shadowy form stood in the wake of a swaying belt of moonlight that swept the deck a bit abaft the mainmast. It was the same figure, that I had just been attributing to my fancy. I will admit that I felt more than startled. I was quite a bit frightened. I was convinced now that this was no mere imaginary thing. It was a human figure, and yet with the flicker of the moonlight and the shadows chasing over it, I was unable to say more than that. Then, as I stood there, irresolute and afraid, I got the thought that someone was acting the goat. Though for what reason or purpose I never stopped to consider. I was glad of any suggestion that my common sense assured me was not impossible, and for the moment I felt quite relieved. That side to the question had not presented itself to me before. I began to pluck up courage. I accused myself of getting fanciful. Otherwise I should have tumbled to it earlier. And then, funnily enough, in spite of all my reasoning, I was still afraid to go aft and discovered who that was, standing on the lee side of the main deck. Yet I felt that if I shirked it, I was only fit to be dumped overboard. And so I went, though not with any great speed, as you can imagine. I had gone half the distance, and still the figure remained there, motionless and silent, the moonlight and shadows playing over it with each roll of the ship. I think I tried to be surprised. If it were one of the fellows playing the fool, he must have heard me coming, and why didn't he scoot while he still had the chance? And where could he have hidden himself before? All these things I asked myself in a rush, with a queer mixture of doubt and belief, and in the meantime I was drawing nearer. I had passed the house and was not 12 paces distant, when abruptly the silent figure made 3 quick strides to the port rail and climbed over it into the sea. I rushed to the side and stared over, but nothing met my gaze except the shadow of the ship sweeping over the moonlit sea. How long I stared down blankly into the water, it would be impossible to say. Certainly for a good minute. I felt blank, just horribly blank. It was such a beastly confirmation of the unnaturalness of the thing I had concluded to be only a sort of brain fancy. I seemed for a little time deprived, of the power of coherent thought. I suppose I was dazed, mentally stunned in a way. As I have said, a minute or so must have gone while I'd been staring into the dark of the water under the ship's side. Then I suddenly came to my ordinary self. The second mate was singing out, "Lee fore brace!" I went to the braces, like a chap in a dream. Chapter 2. What Tammy the Prentice Saw. The next morning in my watch below, I had a look at the places where that strange thing had come aboard and left the ship. But I found nothing unusual, and no clue to help me understand the mystery of the strange man. For several days after that, all went quietly, though I prowled about the decks at night trying to discover anything fresh that might tend to throw some light on the matter. I was careful to say nothing to anyone about the thing I had seen. In any case, I felt sure I should only have been laughed at. Several nights passed away in this manner, and I was no nearer to an understanding of the affair. And then, in the middle watch, something happened. I was at the wheel. Tammy, one of the first voyage prentices, was keeping time, walking up and down the lee side of the poop deck. The second mate was forward, leaning over the break of the poop, smoking. The weather still continued fine, and the moon, though declining, was sufficiently powerful to make every detail about the poop stand out distinctly. 3 bells had gone, and I'll admit I was feeling sleepy. Indeed, I believe I must have dozed, for the old packet steered very easily, and there was precious little to do beyond giving her the odd spoke now and again. And then, all at once, it seemed to me that I heard someone calling my name, softly. I could not be certain, and first glanced forward to where the second stood smoking, and from him I looked into the binnacle. The ship's head was right on course, and I felt easier. Then suddenly, I heard it again. There was no doubt about it this time, and I glanced to leeward. There I saw Tammy reaching over the steering gear, his hand out in the act of trying to touch my arm. I was about to ask him what the devil he wanted when he held up his finger for silence and pointed forward along the lee side of the poop. In the dim light, his face showed palely, and he seemed much agitated. For a few seconds I stared in the direction he indicated, but could see nothing. "What is it?" I asked, in an undertone. After a couple of moments' further ineffectual peering, "I can't see anything." "Hush," he muttered, hoarsely, without looking in my direction. Then all at once, with a quick little gasp, he sprang across the wheel box and stood beside me, trembling. His gaze appeared to follow the movements of something I could not see. I must say I was startled. His movement had shown such terror, and the way he stared to leeward made me think he saw something uncanny. "What the deuce is up with you?" I asked sharply. And then I remembered the second mate. I glanced forward to where he lounged. His back was still towards us, and he had not seen Tammy. Then I turned to the boy. "For goodness' sake, get to the leeward before the second sees you," I said. "If you want to say anything, say it across the wheel box. You've been dreaming." Even as I spoke, the little beggar caught at my sleeve with one hand, and pointing across to the log wheel with the other, screamed, "He's coming! He's coming!" At this instant the second mate came running aft, singing out to know what was the matter. Then suddenly crouching under the rail, near the log wheel, I saw something that looked like a man, but so hazy and unreal that I could scarcely say that I saw anything. Yet like a flash my thoughts ripped back to the silent figure I had seen in the flicker of the moonlight a week earlier. The second mate reached me, and I pointed dumbly, and yet as I did so, it was with the knowledge that he would not be able to see what I saw. Queer, wasn't it? And then, almost in a breath, I lost sight of the thing, and became aware that Tammy was hugging my knees. The second continued to stare at the log reel for a brief instant. Then he turned to me with a sneer. "Been asleep, the pair of you, I suppose." Then, without waiting for my denial, he told Tammy to go to hell out of it and stop his noise, or he'd boot him off the poop. After that he walked forward to the break of the poop, and lit his pipe again, walking forward and aft every few minutes, and eyeing me at times, I thought, with a strange, half-doubtful, half-puzzled look. Later, as soon as I was relieved, I hurried down to the prentice's berth. I was anxious to speak to Tammy. There were a dozen questions that worried me, and I was in doubt what I ought to do. I found him crouched on a sea-chest, his knees up to his chin and his gaze fixed on the doorway, with a frightened stare. I put my head into the berth, and he gave a gasp. Then he saw who it was, and his face relaxed something of its strained expression. He said, "Come in," in a low voice, which he tried to steady, and I stepped over the washboard and sat down on a chest facing him. "What was it?" he asked, putting his feet down on the deck and leaning forward. "For God's sake, tell me what it was." His voice had risen, and I put my hand up to warn him. "Quiet," I said, "you'll wake the others." He repeated the question, but in a lower tone. I hesitated before answering him. I felt all at once that it might be better to deny all knowledge, to say I hadn't seen anything unusual. I thought quickly and made answer on the turn of the moment. "What was what?" I said. "That's just the thing I've come to ask you. A pretty pair of fools you made of the two of us, up on the poop just now with your hysterical tomfoolery." I concluded my remark in a tone of anger. "I didn't," he answered in a passionate whisper. "You know I didn't. You know you saw it yourself. You pointed it out to the second mate. I saw you." The little beggar was nearly crying between fear and vexation at my assumed unbelief. "Rot," I replied. "You know jolly well you were sleeping in your timekeeping. You dreamed something and woke up suddenly. You were off your chump." I was determined to reassure him if possible. Though goodness, I wanted assurance myself. If he had known of that other thing I had seen down on the main deck, what then? "I wasn't asleep any more than you were," he said bitterly, "and you know it. You're just fooling me. The ship's haunted." "What?" I said sharply. "She's haunted," he said again. "She's haunted." "Who says so?" I inquired, in a tone of unbelief. I do, and you know it. Everybody knows it. But they don't more than half believe it. I didn't until tonight. Damned rot, I answered. That's all a bloomin' old shellback's yarn. She's no more haunted than I am. It's not damn rot, he replied, totally unconvinced. It's not an old shellback's yarn. Why won't you say you saw it? He cried, growing almost tearfully excited and raising his voice again. I warned him not to wake the sleepers. Why won't you say you saw it? He repeated. I got up from the chest and went towards the door. You're a young idiot, I said, and I should advise you not to go gassing about like this, round the decks. Take my tip and turn in and get a sleep. You're talking dotty. Tomorrow you'll perhaps feel what an unholy ass you've made of yourself. I stepped over the washboard and left him. I believe he followed me to the door to say something further, but I was halfway for it by then. For the next couple of days I avoided him as much as possible, taking care never to let him catch me alone. I was determined, if possible, to convince him that he'd been mistaken in supposing that he'd seen anything that night. Yet after all, it was little enough use, as you will soon see. For on the night of the second day, there was a further extraordinary development that made denial on my part useless. Chapter 3. The Man Up the Main. It occurred in the first watch, just after 6 bells. I was forward, sitting on the forehatch. No one was about the main deck. The night was exceedingly fine, and the wind had dropped away almost to nothing, so that the ship was very quiet. Suddenly I heard the second mate's voice. "In the main rigging there. Who's that going aloft?" I sat up on the hatch and listened. There succeeded an intense silence. Then the second mate's voice again. He was evidently getting wild. "Do you damn well hear me? What the hell are you doing up there? Come down!" I rose to my feet and walked up to windward. From there I could see the break of the poop. The second mate was standing by the starboard ladder. He appeared to be looking up at something that was hidden from me by the topsails. As I stared, he broke out again. "Hell and damnation! Come down when I tell you!" He stamped on the poop and repeated the order savagely, but there was no answer. I started to walk aft. What had happened? Who had gone aloft? Who'd be fool enough to go without being told? And then all at once a thought came to me. The figure Tammy and I had seen. Had the second mate seen something? Someone? I hurried on and then stopped suddenly. In the same moment there came a shrill blast of the second's whistle. He was whistling for the watch, and I turned and ran to the forecastle to rouse them out. Another minute, and I was hurrying aft with them to see what was wanted. His voice met us halfway. "Up the main, some of you, smartly now, and find out who that damn fool is up there. See what mischief he's up to." "Aye, aye, sir," several of the men sung out, and a couple jumped into the weather rigging. I joined them, and the rest were proceeding to follow, but the second shouted for someone to go to the leeward, in case the fellow tried to get down that side. As I followed the other two loft, I heard the second mate tell Tammy, whose timekeeping it was, to get down on the main deck with the other prentice, and keep an eye on the fore and aft stays. "He may try down one of those when he's cornered," I heard him explain. "If you see anything, just sing out for me right away." Tammy hesitated. "Well?" said the second mate sharply. "Nothing, sir," said Tammy, and went down onto the main deck. The first man to windward had reached the futtock shrouds. His head was above the top, and he was taking a preliminary look before venturing higher. "See anything, Jock?" asked Plummer, the man next above me. "No," said Jock tersely, and climbed over the top and so disappeared from my sight. The fellow ahead of me followed. He reached the futtock rigging and stopped to spit. I was close at his heels, and he looked down to me. "What's up anyway?" he said. "What's he seen? Who's we chasing after?" I said I didn't know. Then he swung up into the topmast rigging. I followed on. The chaps on the lee side were about level with us. Under the foot of the topsail I could see Tammy and the other prentice down on the main deck, looking upwards. The fellows were a bit excited, in a sort of subdued way, though I am inclined to think that there was far more curiosity, and perhaps a certain consciousness of the strangeness of it all. I know that looking to leeward there was a tendency to keep well together, in which I sympathized. "Must be a stowaway," one of the men suggested. I grabbed at the idea instantly. Perhaps. And then in a moment I dismissed it. I remembered how the first thing had stepped over the rail into the sea. That matter could not be explained in such a manner. With regard to this, I was curious and anxious. I had seen nothing this time. What could the second mate have seen, I wondered? Were we chasing fancies? Or was there really someone, something real, among the shadows above us? My thoughts returned to that thing Tammy and I had seen near the log reel. I remembered how incapable the second mate had been of seeing anything then. I remembered how natural it had seemed that he should not be able to see it. I caught the word stowaway again. After all, that might explain away this affair. It would... My train of thought was broken suddenly. One of the men was shouting and gesticulating. "I seize him! I seize him!" He was pointing upwards, over our heads. "Where?" said the man above me. "Where?" I was looking up for all I was worth. I was conscious of a certain sense of relief. It is real, then, I said to myself. I screwed my head round and looked along the yards above us. Yet still I could see nothing. Nothing except shadows and patches of light. Down on deck I caught the second mate's voice. "Have you got him?" he was shouting. "Not yet, sir," sung out the lowest man on the lee side. "We seize him, sir," added Quoin. "I don't," I said. "There he is again," he said. We had reached the topgallant rigging, and he was pointing up to the royal yard. "You're a fool, Quoin, that's what you are." The voice came from above. It was Jock's, and there was a burst of laughter at Quoin's expense. I could see Jock now. He was standing in the rigging just below the yard. He'd gone straight away up, while the rest of us were mooning over the top. "You're a fool, Quoin," he said again, "and I'm thinking the second's just as soft." He began to descend. "Then there's no one?" I asked. "No," he said briefly. As we reached the deck, the second mate ran down off the poop. He came towards us with an expectant air. "You've got him?" he asked confidently. "There wasn't anyone," I said. "What?" he nearly shouted. "You're hiding something," he continued angrily, and glancing from one to another. "Out with it! Who was it?" "We're hiding nothing," I replied, speaking for the lot. "There's no one up there." The second looked round upon us. "Am I a fool?" he asked contemptuously. There was an assenting silence. "I saw him myself," he continued. "Tammy here saw him. He wasn't over the top when I first spotted him. There's no mistake about that. It's all damn rot saying he's not there." "Well, he's not, sir," I answered. "Jock went right up to the royal yard." The second mate said nothing in immediate reply, but went aft a few steps and looked up the main. Then he turned to the two prentices. "Sure you two boys didn't see anything coming down from the main?" he inquired suspiciously. "Yes, sir," they answered together. "Anyway," I heard him mutter to himself, "I'd have spotted him myself if he had." "Have you any idea, sir, who it was you saw?" I asked at this juncture. He looked at me keenly. "No," he said. He thought for a few moments, while we all stood about in silence, waiting for him to let us go. "By the holy poker!" he exclaimed suddenly. "I ought to have thought of that before." He turned and eyed us individually. "You're all here?" he asked. "Yes, sir," we said in chorus. I could see that he was counting us. Then he spoke again. "All of you men stay where you are. Tammy, you go into your place and see if the other fellows are in their bunks. Then come and tell me. Smartly now." The boy went, and he turned to the other apprentice. "You get along forward to the forecastle," he said. "Count the other watch, then come aft and report to me." As the youngster disappeared along the deck to the forecastle, Tammy returned from his visit to the glory hole to tell the second mate that the other two apprentices were sound asleep in their bunks. Whereupon the second bundled him off to the carpenter's and sailmaker's berth to see whether they were turned in. While he was gone, the other boy came aft and reported that all the men were in their bunks and asleep. "Sure?" Second asked him. "Quite, sir," he answered. The second mate made a quick gesture. "Go and see if the steward is in his berth," he said abruptly. It was plain to me that he was tremendously puzzled. "You've something to learn yet, Mr. Second Mate," I thought to myself. Then I fell to wondering to what conclusions he would come. A few seconds later, Tammy returned to say that the carpenter, sailmaker, and doctor were all turned in. The second mate muttered something and told him to go down into the saloon and see whether the first and third mates by any chance were not in their berths. Tammy started off and then halted. "Shall I have a look into the old man's place, sir, while I'm down there?" he inquired. "No," said the second mate. "Do what I told you, and then come and tell me. If anyone's to go into the captain's cabin, it's got to be me." Tammy said, "Aye, aye, sir," and skipped away, up onto the poop. While he was gone, the other apprentice came up to say that the steward was in his berth, and that he wanted to know what the hell he was fooling around his part of the ship for. The second mate said nothing for nearly a minute. Then he turned to us and told us we might go forward. As we moved off in a body and talking in undertones, Tammy came down from the poop and went up to the second mate. I heard him say the two mates were in their berths asleep. And then he added, as if it were an afterthought, "So's the old man." "I thought I told you," the second mate began. "I didn't, sir," Tammy said. "His cabin door was open." The second mate started to go aft. I caught a fragment of a remark he was making to Tammy. "Accounted for the whole crew, He went up onto the poop. I didn't catch the rest. I had loitered a moment. Now, however, I hurried after the others. As we neared the forecastle, one bell went, and we roused out the other watch and told them what jinx we had been up to. "I reckon he must be rocky," one of the men remarked. "Not him," said another. "He's been having 40 winks on the break, and dreamed his mother-in-law had come to visit, friendly-like." There was some laughter at the suggestion, and I caught myself smiling along with the rest, though I had no reason for sharing their belief, that there was nothing in it all. "Might have been a stowaway, you know," I heard Coyne, the one who had suggested it before, remark to one of the ABs named Stubbins, a short, rather surly-looking chap. "Might have been hell," returned Stubbins. "Stowaways ain't such fools as all that." "I don't know," said the first. "I wish I'd asked the second what he thought about it." "I don't think it was a stowaway, somehow," I said, chipping in. "What would a stowaway want aloft? Guess he'd be trying more for the steward's pantry." "You bet he would, every time," said Stubbins. He lit his pipe and sucked at it slowly. "I don't understand it all the same," he remarked, after a moment's silence. "Neither do I said, and after that I was quiet for a while, listening to the run of conversation on the subject. Presently my glance fell upon Williams, the man who had spoken to me about shadows. He was sitting in his bunk, smoking, and making no effort to join in the talk. I went across to him. "What do you think of it, Williams?" I asked. "Do you think the second mate really saw anything?" He looked at me with a sort of gloomy suspicion, but said nothing. I felt a trifle annoyed by his silence, but took care not to show it. After a few moments, I went on, "Do you know, Williams, I'm beginning to understand what you meant that night, when you said there were too many shadows." "What do you mean?" he said, pulling his pipe out from his mouth, and fairly surprised into answering. "What I say, of course," I said. "There are too many shadows." He sat up, and then forward, out from his bunk, extending his hand and pipe. His eyes plainly showed his excitement. "Have you seen?" He hesitated, and looked at me, struggling inwardly to express himself. "Well?" I prompted. For perhaps a minute he tried to say something. Then his expression altered suddenly from doubt, and something else more indefinite, to a pretty grim look of determination. He spoke. "I'm blind," he said. "If I don't take a payday out of her, shadows or no shadows." I looked at him with astonishment. "What's it got to do with your getting a payday out of her?" I asked. He nodded his head with a sort of stolid resolution. "Look here," he said. I waited. The crowd cleared. He indicated with his hand and pipe towards the stern. "You mean in Frisco?" I said. "Yes," he replied. "And without a cent of their pay. I stayed." I comprehended him suddenly. "You think they saw?" I hesitated, then I said, "Shadows?" He nodded, but said nothing. "And so they all bunked?" He nodded again, and began tapping out his pipe on the edge of his bunk board. "And the officers and the skipper?" I asked. "They got new ones," he said, and got out of his bunk. For 8 bells was striking. Chapter 4. The Fooling with the Sail. It was on the Friday night that the second mate had to watch aloft looking for the man up the main, and for the next 5 days little else was talked about. Though, with the exception of Williams, Tammy, and myself, no one seemed to think of treating the matter seriously. Perhaps I should not exclude Quoin, who still persisted on every occasion that there was a stowaway aboard. As for the second mate, I have very little doubt now, but that he was beginning to realize there was something deeper and less understandable than he had first dreamed of. Yet all the same, I know he had to keep his guesses and half-formed opinions pretty well to himself, for the old man and the first mate chaffed him unmercifully about his bogey. This I got from Tammy, who had heard them both ragging him during the second dog watch the following day. There was another thing, Tammy told me, that showed how the second mate bothered about his inability to understand the mysterious appearance and disappearance of the man he had seen go aloft. He had made Tammy give him every detail he could remember about the figure we had seen by the log-reel. What is more, the second had not even affected to treat the matter lightly, nor as a thing to be sneered at, but had listened seriously and asked a great many questions. It is very evident to me that he was reaching out towards the only possible conclusion, though goodness knows it was one that was impossible and improbable enough. It was on the Wednesday night, after the 5 days of talk I have mentioned, that there came to me and to those who knew another element of fear. And yet I can quite understand that at that time those who had seen nothing would find little to be afraid of in all that I am going to tell you. Still, even they were much puzzled and astonished, and perhaps, after all, a little awed. But there was so much in the affair that was inexplicable, and yet again such a lot that was natural and commonplace. For when all is said and done, it was nothing more than the blowing adrift of one of the sails, yet accompanied by what were really significant details. Significant, that is, in the light of that which Tammy and I and the second mate knew. 7 bells and then 1 had gone in the first watch, and our side was being roused out to relieve the mates. Most of the men were already out of their bunks and sitting about on their sea-chests, getting into their togs. Suddenly one of the apprentices in the other watch put his head through the doorway on the port side. "The mate wants to know," he said, "which of you chaps made fast the fore royal last watch." "What do you want to know that for?" inquired one of the men. "The lee side's blowing adrift," said the apprentice, "and he says that the chap who made it fast to go up and see to it as soon as the watch is relieved." "Oh, does he?" "Well, it wasn't me, anyhow," replied the man. "You better ask some of the others." "Ask what?" inquired Plummer, getting out of his bunk sleepily. The apprentice repeated his message. The man yawned and stretched himself. "Let me see," he muttered, and scratched his head with one hand while he fumbled for his trousers with the other. "Who made the foreroyal fast?" He got into his trousers and stood up. "Why, the ordinary, of course. Who else do you suppose?" "That's all I wanted to know," said the apprentice, and went away. "Hi, Tom," Stubbins sang out to the ordinary. "Wake up, you lazy young devil. The mate's just sent to inquire who it was made the fore royal fast. It's all blowing adrift, and he says you're to get along as soon as the 8 bells goes and make it fast again." Tom jumped out of his bunk and began to dress quickly. "Blowing adrift," he said. "There ain't all that much wind. And I tucked the ends of the gaskets well in under the other turns." "Perhaps one of the gaskets is rotten and given way," suggested Stubbins. "Anyway, you better hurry up. It's just on 8 bells. A minute later, 8 bells went, and we trooped away aft for roll call. As soon as the names were called over, I saw the mate lean towards the second and say something. Then the second mate sung out, "Tom!" "Sir," answered Tom. "Was it you made fast the foreroyal last watch?" "Yes, sir." "How's that it's broken adrift?" "Can't say, sir." "Well, it has, and you'd better jump aloft and shove the gasket round it again, and mind you make a better job of it this time." "Aye, aye, sir," said Tom, and followed the rest of us forward. Reaching the fore-rigging, he climbed into it and began to make his way leisurely aloft. I could see him with a fair amount of distinctness, as the moon was very clear and bright, though getting old. I went over to the weather pin rail and leaned up against it, watching him, while I filled my pipe. The other men, both the watch on deck and the watch below, had gone into the forecastle, so that I imagined I was the only one on the main deck. Yet a minute later, I discovered that I was mistaken. For, as I proceeded to light up, I saw Williams, the young cockney, come out from under the lee of the house, and turn and look up at the ordinary as he went steadily upwards. I was a little surprised, as I knew he and 3 of the others had a poker fight on, and that he'd won over 60 pounds of tobacco. I believe I opened my mouth to sing out to him to know why he wasn't playing, and then all at once there came into my mind the memory of my first conversation with him. I remembered that he had said sails were always blowing adrift at night. I remembered the then unaccountable emphasis that he had laid on those 2 words. And remembering that, I felt suddenly afraid. For all at once the absurdity had struck me of a sail, even a badly stowed one, blowing adrift in such fine and calm weather as we were then having. I wondered I had not seen before that there was something queer and unlikely about the affair. Sails don't blow adrift in fine weather, with the sea calm and the ship as steady as a rock. I moved away from the rail and went towards Williams. He knew something, or at least he guessed at something. There was very much a blankness to me at the time. Up above, the boy was climbing up. To what? That was the thing that made me feel so frightened. Ought I to tell all I knew and guessed? And then who should I tell? I should only be laughed at. Williams turned towards me and spoke. "God," he said. "It started again." "What?" I said, though I knew what he meant. "Them sails," he answered, and made a gesture towards the foreroyal. I glanced up briefly. All the lee side of the sail was adrift, and the bunt gasket outwards. Lower I saw Tom. He was just hoisting himself into the gallant rigging. William spoke again. "We lost 2 of 'em. Just the same way coming out." "2 of the men?" I exclaimed. "Yes," he said tersely. "I can't understand," I went on. "I never heard anything about it." "Who'd you got to tell you about it?" he asked. I made no reply to his question. Indeed, I had scarcely comprehended it, for the problem of what I ought to do in the matter had risen again in my mind. "I've a good mind to go aft and tell the second mate all I know," I said. "He's seen something himself that he can't explain away, and anyway, I can't stand this state of things. If the second mate knew all—" "Go on," he cut in, interrupting